So in the category of distracting, deflecting, and dividing, in a series of tweets yesterday, President Trump said that a group of progressive congresswomen critical of his immigration policies should go back to the countries they originally came from. He tweeted, "So interesting to see progressive Democrat congresswomen who originally came from countries whose governments are a complete and total catastrophe, the worst, most corrupt, inept anywhere in the world, if they even have a functioning government at all, now loudly and viciously telling the people of the United States, the greatest and most powerful nation on earth, how our government is to be run. Why don't they go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came? Then come back and show us how it is done. These places need your help badly. You can't leave fast enough. I'm sure that Nancy Pelosi would be very happy to quickly work out free travel arrangements." Although he didn't mention anyone by name, the four apparent targets of the president's tweets were Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, who was born in the Bronx to the parents of Puerto Rican descent.
Americans.
The president wouldn't know that. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, who was born in Detroit to Palestinian immigrants. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts, who is black and born in Cincinnati.
Well, Cincinnati, I mean,
Chicago.
That's almost Canada.
Right.
I mean, really.
And Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, who was born in Somalia, but moved to the United States when she was 12 and is a naturalized U.S. citizen. What an incredible story, the American dream. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi came out in defense of those congresswomen, tweeting yesterday, "When President Trump tells four American congresswomen to go back to their countries, he reaffirms his plan to make America great again has always been about making America white again. Our diversity is our strength and our unity is our power." She went on to say, "I reject President Trump's xenophobic comments meant to divide our nation. Rather than attack members of Congress, he should work with us and work for humane immigration policy that reflects American values. Stop the raids. Families belong together." The president's tweets were also condemned by other congressional Democrats, including several presidential candidates. Republicans remained largely silent on the matter. President Trump later appeared to double down, tweeting, "So sad to see the Democrats are sticking up for people who speak so badly of our country and who, in addition, hate Israel with a true and unbridled passion. Whenever confronted, they call their adversaries, including Nancy Pelosi, racist. Their disgusting language and the many terrible things they say about the United States must not be allowed to go unchallenged. If the Democrat Party wants to continue to condone such disgraceful behavior, then we look even more forward to seeing you at the ballot box."
Eddie. Eddie.
Triple D, distract, deflect, divide.
Yeah. Eddie, irony is dead. He died quite some time ago. South Park just finally gave up because Donald Trump was more bizarre, of course, than anything that they could lampoon. But here we have a tweet from a man whose parents met when the son of German immigrants met a domestic worker who had recently immigrated to America, and they met in Queens, a borough that AOC represents. Using Donald Trump's logic, instead of saying the American dream is dead in 2016, instead of talking about American carnage, instead of saying that America was, quote, crippled, using his own logic, he should have gone back to Scotland instead of running for president of the United States. Because actually, his mother was an immigrant to this country.
And Joe, so is his wife. So is his father-in-law, mother-in-law. The one thing that's consistent is that they're all white. And for the president of the United States, this country is for white people, period. The rest of us should just simply be thankful that we're here. If we decide or deign to criticize the country, we suggest to those that we're not grateful. For him, it is a white nationalist position. We need to understand that for what it is. It is a racist position at its core. But I want to say something really quickly, Joe. I think you're right about the political calculus, that he's coming off a week that was pretty bad. But Donald Trump understands that there's a cold civil war going on in this country. That there's some folks out here who are unsettled, uneasy by the demographic shifts that are happening. They're looking at the television and they're seeing these black and white couples, these racially ambiguous kids selling cereal. They're unsettled by what's happening. And Donald Trump has fed on that anger and angst from day one, from the day he announced his presidency to how he's governed. There's a cold civil war. And as he's playing politics, there are children who are worried that they're going to have their parents or their father or their uncle is going to be taken away from them. They're worried that if they go outside, their families who go outside, they're worried that ICE is going to raid. Even if they don't, they're living under terror. There are folks like me. I receive emails on a regular basis telling me to go back to Africa, right? And so part of what he's doing is exploiting what's happening in the country. And that cold civil war, Joe, is not just simply the loud racists that he's appealing to. It's about all of us who hold these certain understandings of what this country is and how we're fighting about who we're going to be. So you're right, it's a short-term game. It's a political calculus, but something is happening. We've only had two moments like this before in our country's history, from my vantage point. One was the Civil War and Reconstruction. Historians call that the second founding. The other was the mid-20th century, Joe, and that was the Black freedom struggle. Historians call that the second Reconstruction. Both of those moments constituted an opportunity for the country to reimagine itself. Here we are in this moment, and the President of the United States has announced which side he's on. That's where we are.
You know, Karine, I think we don't know exactly how this plays out in the long run. We do know a couple of things, though, about where we also are. This is a nation that elected a black man president 2 times. In fact, he got elected with 53% of the vote. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was the largest vote total in 20 years for any, percentage-wise, for any presidential candidate running. And we're also at a place, too, where I think racists and bigots are encouraged by this sort of talk. There have also been some studies that we've reported about here that actually Donald Trump's racism is actually making Americans more acutely aware of racism in their own midst and making them more sensitive and actually making America less racist. Of course, that's one study. We won't know for another decade, perhaps. But still, there is a part of me that wonders if this not only backfires on him politically in the short run, but also backfires on white nationalists by driving them out of the rocks from which they came, underneath the rocks they came, and exposing them for the horrific human beings that they are.
Yeah, Joe, let's hope so. One thing that I would say, Joe, that Donald Trump made it very clear to all of us is that we're not living in a post-racial America. And many of us knew that for some time. And what Donald Trump did yesterday, he's very aware. He knows exactly what he's doing. It's basically what you, Joe, and Mika were saying, is that he's running a base election. So what he's doing is he's just doubling down. He basically traded in his racist dog whistle for a racist bullhorn and a megaphone. I mean, this is what he does. Just think about this. In the 1990s, there used to be these blind taste test commercials that were done where they would blindfold someone and they would say to them, what's the difference between a McDonald's and a Burger King burger, right? What's the difference between a Coke and a Pepsi? Here you have yesterday a Twitter feed. You could not, if you did a blind test on the Twitter feed, you could not tell the difference between the Twitter feed of the President of the United States and a radical racist white supremacist. You could not tell the difference.
I mean, you seriously, you could, you could ask people, did David Duke say this? or did Donald Trump say this?
That's exactly right, Joe. And here's the thing. This goes back to the point that I was trying to make at the beginning here, which is Donald Trump is not testing his 2020 strategy. This is his 2020 strategy. It is racism.
That's correct.
It is fear, right?
It's his last hope.
Bigotry. Exactly. This is his last hope. He is doubling down, tripling down. And the scary thing about it, Joe, is what you and Mika was saying earlier, is that the Republican Party is silent. They're not saying anything. Right. So he's going to continue to do this because it's only one side that's talking about it, right? Or people who are anti-Trumpers like yourself. No one, the Republicans who should be helping us keep him in check are not, because they're getting what they want. And that is the scary part in all of this.
Well, and to Kareen's point, Joe, I mean, many would argue that why he's doing this, for note to Republicans, is not to help you out on certain policies that you just might be able to squeeze out of him, that you sit there in your fear. You sit there spineless, incapable of speaking out against racism because you think you might squeeze something out of him. He might stand by you in some way and help you get votes. It's pathetic. Many would say he's doing this to bottom feed for his last hope to win the election so he doesn't have to face, for example, the Southern District of New York. He's not doing it for you. He's doing it for himself, and it's all he's got left.
Well, and you look at David French, the tweet that we just put up from David French. There were quite a few conservative commentators yesterday that came out and attacked Donald Trump. And David French said, take the Judge Curiel moment, mix in the S-hole country, sprinkle in a few Tucker monologues, and you've got this miserable, hateful stew. But the truly depressing part will be the inevitable GOP gaslighting, rationalizations, and minimizations of his defense. And Mike Barnicle, I do think, for me, we all know who Donald Trump is. For me, the story that is not, ground noise, the story that is the signal, is the fact that the major political party in America that has controlled the House and the Senate for the better part of 2 decades, the entire Republican Party has been mute when Donald Trump made a statement that every one of them would have criticized 5 years ago, coming from David Duke. They are that frog in the boiling water. I mean, let me just call him out. Lindsey Graham. Why isn't Lindsey Graham saying something? This is the sort of thing Lindsey Graham warned the Republican Party about before Donald Trump was in power. Ben Sasse. Where is Ben Sasse? Ben Sasse,
Where is
a lot
he?
of people thought that Ben Sasse was going to take politics to a higher plane. This doesn't look like a higher plane. Let's talk about people who were in, like, for instance, Cory Gardner in Colorado. That's a swing state. Cory's in trouble.
Joe, how about Lamar Alexander, who's retiring? I mean, Lamar Alexander isn't even running again, and he has been a mainstay of so many good things that have happened in the Republican Party. Where is Lamar Alexander? I mean, I can give you examples that just don't make sense that they're not speaking out. It's bizarre.
Well, why aren't they speaking out? Why hasn't Mitt Romney spoken out yet? Why hasn't Tom Tillis, who's in a swing state? Where's Joni Ernst? Where are all of these people?
I think Mitch McConnell has a shock collar on him.
Where are all of these people that should be? This is not hard, Mike Barnicle. This is what all of America used to criticize David Duke for saying 5 years ago, and this is why David Duke has publicly, time and again, celebrated the presidency of Donald Trump. Is that where the Republican Party wants to be? Because that's where they are right now.
They are cowering in the corner. They are a party now that is not only mute, as you pointed out, Joe, they now have no conscience. They care more about their jobs than they do about the country. They have a president of the United States. You can talk about diversion. He did this to deflect this, to get our attention over here instead of there. No. What he did yesterday, that's who he is. That's who he is. First question that ought to be asked Donald Trump in any public forum is, when you hear the word America, Mr. President, tell us what you think it means. What do you see in that word? And it won't be what this country really is all about.
And it's also, this is far from the first time he's done this. And that must be said again. This is not just a political calculus to distract from bad headlines. So that may have played a role into the timing of this tweet. He has shown time and time again. Look at the history. The Central Park Five. His campaign announcement was listing Mexican immigrants, many of them as rapists. We know what he said in Charlottesville. The way he described African nations as bleep hole countries. The fact that his entire political career was based on the racist lie of birtherism.
And on division.
And division and in birtherism, questioning whether the first African-American president of the United States was born in this country. And what he got yesterday was complete silence from Republicans. He has paid no penalty from his own party for any of these remarks. And yesterday, I was there with the White House when that tweet came out about the Democratic congresswoman. Minutes later, the president stepped out of the White House, got into his motorcade, and went golfing at his golf club in Virginia, where he spent the entire day. He returned to the White House that evening. I'm told he gauged some reaction. There was no criticism from Republicans. It was radio silence. There was nothing in the conservative media attacking him. He was emboldened, and he doubled down with another tweet. This is who he is. The Republican Party is going to, as long as they remain silent, this is who he's going to continue to be.
And Mika, in the poll that we showed that showed Donald Trump losing to Bernie Sanders by 7 points, Joe Biden by 9 points, Elizabeth Warren by 5 points, 9 out of 10 Republicans approve of Donald Trump's performance as president. Let me say that again.
No.
9 out of 10 Republicans approve of Donald Trump's performance as president of the United States, a performance that has included one racist screed after another. So this is not just about Donald Trump. This is not just about elected leaders in Washington, D.C. This is about a political party now that has embraced the racial ideology of David Duke. Good luck with that in the years to come, because you are going to be left on the dustbin of political history, Republicans.
And we've put this all in the proper context this morning, covering this story, looking at the poll numbers where he loses to 3 top Democrats, including Elizabeth Warren
and Bernie
Sanders, and also in the shadows of him having his labor secretary finally step down, the labor secretary who was the U.S. attorney who gave Jeffrey Epstein, Donald Trump's friend who he had a party with calendar girls with, a sweetheart deal. So in the context of all of that, the president distracting, deflecting, and dividing. Still ahead on Morning Joe, we'll get to that Maureen Dowd piece that Joe referenced at the top of the show. Plus, presidential candidate Bill de Blasio joins the conversation. He's back in New York after a blackout plunged parts of the city into darkness over the weekend. And later today, we're going to sit down with presidential candidate Joe Biden in Iowa as he unveils more policy proposals and fights to stay the Democratic frontrunner. We'll bring you that full interview tomorrow on Morning Joe. Let's now bring in.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.